They called him a coward. He never fired a shot. 75 men lived because of him. 80 years after the last battles of World War II, that paradox still stops us. In 1945, a handful of men in a scarred unit called him a coward for refusing a rifle. Within months, the same man would be recommended for the nation's highest military honor, not for killing, but for saving. This is the story of Desmond Doss, a son of Lynchburg who, by holding fast to a conscience and a faith that forbade violence, forced an army and a world to rethink what bravery could look like. If you like stories of unlikely heroes, subscribe for more. Desmond Thomas Doss was born into the slow southern rhythms of Lynchburg, Virginia. The house where he grew up was a place where the Bible sat openly on a kitchen table and a church calendar shaped the week. His mother read the family the Ten Commandments. Sabbath was observed not simply as ritual but as a boundary, a weekly insistence that some things were untouchable. His father had a volatile temper. One night, after a violent domestic outburst in which a gun was fired and a family member was hurt, young Desmond made a promise that would follow him into uniform. He would never take a life. That promise steeped itself in boyhood experiences. A serious knee infection as a teenager threatened to end any thought of physical feats. Family prayer, the care of neighbors, and a faith community that taught healing and hope pulled him through. The recovery became, in his telling and in the way his family remembered it, a small testament to a God who watched over the fragile. It also reinforced a sense of dependence on conscience over impulse. To Desmond, "Thou shalt not kill" was not a slogan. It was a line to live by. When war spread across the globe, the Selective Service reached into towns like Lynchburg. In 1942, with a nation mobilizing by the millions, Doss answered the call differently than most. He volunteered to serve, not to shoot, but to save. He would enlist as an Army medic, a role that carried him into the teeth of combat without a weapon to use in his own defense. His is not an easy decision to put alongside typical wartime narratives. To many around him it seemed contradictory. How could a man refuse to wield a gun and still go to war? For Desmond, the contradiction never sat that way. He believed a soldier could serve and still refuse to kill. From the moment he donned the uniform, the pressure began. Training camps in the early 1940s were places of toughness, of drills that hardened hands and hammered reflexes. A young man who would not shoulder a rifle drew scorn. Fellow trainees called him coward. In barracks and on the drill field he was taunted. Officers and peers tested him. At the medical boards and in legal hearings that followed, the Army wrestled with the question, could a man who refused to use arms be a soldier in the modern sense? The law of the time made allowances for conscientious objectors, men who, on grounds of conscience or religion, refused to fight. Many of those men were assigned to non-combatant duties away from the front. Doss insisted he would be a medic with his unit. He wanted to be with his comrades, to share their dangers rather than sit safely behind. That insistence put him on a collision course with military authorities determined to keep order and discipline. He faced near dismissal and the possibility of court-martial. He endured physical and verbal abuse intended to force compliance. In testimony and later recollection, others would describe him as unshakable. He refused not out of fear, but out of conviction. The result was a prolonged and ugly ordeal in which Doss's motives were tested in full view. Military physicians, chaplains, and officers debated whether to honor his request to stay with a rifeless status. The final decision permitted him to remain, but only as a non-combatant medic. It was a compromise that would prove both narrow and profound. He could not carry a weapon, but he could go where bullets flew. The island campaigns of the Pacific would become his proving ground. The first major stretch came on Guam and later on Leyte. These were not sanitized training exercises. The Pacific Theater was a place of scrub and volcanic stone, of dense jungle and coral reefs, of heat that sucked moisture from uniforms and wounds that quickly turned septic. Medics like Doss were a thin line between life and the dark of death. His work was not dramatic in the way films often make it. It was gruesome in its necessity. He learned to staunch bleeding with a steady hand, to apply dressings in cramped, dirty conditions, to keep men breathing long enough for a stretcher and a ship to take them away. On Guam, Under mortar and machine gun fire, Doss moved forward to treat wounded men. Stories from those early battles began to sketch the outline of what he would later become. A man who entered enemy fire without a weapon, who climbed into trenches and dragged men to safety, who would sometimes stay behind to make sure no one was left alive and alone. Soldiers in his company started to see him as a figure apart. Obstinate, religious, but also strangely dependable. When a shell shattered the air and a friend called out through the smoke, Doss answered the call. Leyte hardened him further. The Philippines campaign was chaotic and brutal. Snipers picked off men from palm trees and barns. Infantry units were splintered into small groups fighting for scraps of ground while supply lines ran ragged. On Leyte, Doss earned recognition for actions that went beyond the call of duty. He treated both American and enemy wounded. He earned at least one Bronze Star for his courage under fire, a decoration that in official terms acknowledged valor and service in the face of danger. Yet the badges and citations never quieted the whispers about his refusal to carry a rifle. The central question followed him. Could moral courage stand against military necessity? By the time the 77th Infantry Division sailed for Okinawa, Doss was a familiar, controversial figure. The division had seen months of combat. Men were tired in ways that sleep could not wholly fix. Letters home spoke of missing brothers, of landings at dawn that led only to nights full of screams. The strategic context was clear. Okinawa was to be a decisive stepping stone for an invasion of Japan itself. High Command called it the Typhoon of Steel, an allusion to the scale of men and materiel that would be brought to bear. For the soldiers on the ground, it meant a cliff that towered over the landscape, a ridge that had earned a reputation for swallowing men whole. The ridge itself, known to some as Maida Escarpment and to others by the rough name that would later give a film its title, was a jagged spine of coral and rock rising nearly 100 feet above the surrounding fields. A cliff face of carved bone, it offered defenders commanding fire and attackers a gauntlet of death. American units had launched assaults and been repulsed. Engineers and planners spoke of steep slopes and interlocking fields of fire. The ridge's defenders had prepared it with barbed wire, concealed positions and snipers with clear lines on any man who tried to climb. Into that landscape walked Company B, 307th Infantry, 77th Division, with Desmond Doss among its men. The morning orders carried the weight of routine and dread. They also carried a danger that would test every claim a man had made about courage and conscience. For Doss, the rule remained the same. He would tend the wounded. He would not pick up a rifle. He would not fire a shot. The men who had once jeered at him began, in private and in whispered corridors, to test what that refusal really meant when the shells came. Campfire talk about courage often simplifies it into a single act: a charge, a shot, a hero moment. But courage can be a series of small, stubborn choices made under the worst conditions. For Doss, the real test would come not in training, but on a slope where retreat meant survival, and the wounded meant life or death in a few breaths. The ridge's austere silhouette against the Okinawan sky held a terrible promise. One more day here could yield either an advance that changed the war or a slaughter that left families mourning for months to come. There were moments, even before the ridge, when comrades who had scorned him were forced to face his devotion. A sergeant who once mocked Doss later told interviewers that the medic had crawled forward under fire to bandage his leg. Another soldier remembered watching Doss lower himself into a slit trench while bullets hissed overhead and draw a man's torn blouse together with thread and steadiness that suggested a surgeon's calm. These stories began to rework the narrative. The coward label sounded less like a verdict and more like a recoil, a knee-jerk attempt to fit a complex man into a simple, familiar category. Yet the Army was an institution built to make men interchangeable, to ensure that discipline held in moments of panic. A man who stood apart risked being squeezed out. Doss's status as a non-combatant was brittle. Each angry exchange, each officer's eyebrow, placed him at risk of being sent home. For Doss, going home was never his aim. He wanted to be with his company. He wanted to share danger. He insisted that being a medic in the line was the truer form of service. In letters and in later interviews, Doss's faith is rarely presented as triumphalist. It appears rather as a quiet center of gravity. On Sabbath, he refused to work. He read scripture. He prayed in the moments between actions. When fear pressed in, he did not speak of miracles as proof. He spoke of duty and of a compelling refusal to take another life. Many who served with him later attributed his survival to providence. Some called it luck. The historical record, strict as it must be, cannot adjudicate those claims. What it can show is a pattern. Wherever bullets flew, Doss positioned himself between the dying and the ambulance. The weeks preceding Okinawa sharpened the tone. Casualties were mounting in the Pacific. Hospital ships ferried men back to safer harbors. Field hospitals overflowed. Medical supplies were stretched thin. The 77th Division's commanders briefed men on the unique dangers of the Maida escarpment. Soldiers who had seen too much told newcomers in hushed tones of those who had tried to take the ridge and never come back. The atmosphere was one of a slow, coiling dread, the kind that tightens your throat and makes every command feel heavier. Doss's fellow medics were a small, close ring. They watched him with a mixture of suspicion and increasingly reliance. He worked with an economy of motion. He learned to improvise splints and slings from parachute webbing, to carry 2 men at once when strength allowed, to use ropes and pulleys when the terrain demanded it. In practice, his refusal to bear arms meant he had to double down on everything else, become faster, stronger in carrying stretchers, more inventive when lowering a litter over a ledge. The moral edge of his decision required a practical sharpening. There were small telling episodes that hinted at how the coming days might unfold. Once, during a patrol skirmish, Doss refused an order to retreat until he had accounted for every man. He refused not from stubbornness but from a medic's calculation. A wounded man's chance of survival dropped with every minute left unattended. On the ship from Leyte to Okinawa, he wrote in a letter that he would not take a rifle, but that he would carry a man on his back up any slope if necessary. That simple vow would soon be tested. As the division approached the island, the artillery began to speak. Bombardments tore at the ridgeline. Then came infantry assaults that scraped along its base like teeth. Men fell, some screaming, some silent. In the days before the ridge assault, reconnaissance reported dug-in positions and a network of foxholes that funneled attackers into exposed climbs. Intelligence warned that the defenders were willing to fight to the last man. For the soldiers of Company B, this was more than another fight. It was a place where reputations were made or unmade. The morning the company prepared to climb, the air was hot and tremulous. Smoke from distant bombardment created a sky that was not blue so much as a thin metallic gray. Rucksacks were slung, stretchers were lashed, prayers were offered in private corners. Doss adjusted the straps on his medic bag, checked his dressings, and watched his men with the same steady gaze he always wore. There was no dramatizing his resolve. He was quiet, methodical. His hands, the hands that would later be described as saving dozens of lives, were already at work practicing the motions he would need. If earlier battles had shown Doss's steadiness, none had demanded the continuous courage that would be required on a cliff face under concentrated enemy fire. The Maida escarpment would force men into exposed positions. Retreats would be chaotic. Wounded men would be left in pockets of shrapnel and smoke if no one went back. For a medic who would not rely on a rifle to deter attackers, the calculus was singular. How to reach the wounded, how to move them, how to bring them down a sheer face when the ropes were frayed and the enemy's view was clear. Company B moved out. Orders crackled down a chain of command that itself trembled. At some point in those tense hours, a decision was made higher up to press the assault. Men crept into positions and the first wave found themselves pinned. Then the inevitable, a retreat order. Under concentrated fire, the offensive stalled. Soldiers pulled back, dragging the dead and the wounded as they could. In the confusion, some were left. The command to withdraw did not erase the sight of a comrade crumpled on the slope, pleading in half-formed words for help. It is here, at the edge of collapse and retreat, that the story bends toward what would become legend. Orders had been given to fall back. The company withdrew. But one man, bound by conviction and a medic's oath, refused to leave the wounded behind. He told those who later asked that he would not leave any man to die if there was a chance to save him. Whether the hill was carpeted with American bodies or the ground scarred by enemy shelling, his logic remained simple and immediate. A life lay within reach, and his hands would reach for it. The practical work that followed, finding stretchers, securing ropes, lowering litters over rocks, crawling to the edge to stabilize limbs, required not swagger, but a focused reckoning with danger. When Doss moved into that space, he did it without gunfire fighting by his side. Witnesses would later describe a man with a belligerent calm, lowering wounded men over the cliff, returning again and again while others attempted to reorganize or seek cover. Some would speak of identical tactical miracles, enemy rifles jamming, bullets ricocheting where they might have struck, and attribute those moments to luck, to providence, or to the sheer improbability of human survival. History will catalog what it can, the names of the men, the positions, the units involved. Personal testimony will fill out the texture with memory and conviction. By the time Company B had withdrawn and regrouped, the echoes of the ridge lingered. Men who had once spat insults now spoke of a medic who would not be left abandoned. Judgment shifted in the small moral economies of the foxholes and mess tents. Reports filtered back to higher command. The man who would be accused of cowardice in boot camp had shown a stubborn, unarmed courage in the face of entrenched death. Even so, the immediate tactical picture remained grim. The ridge had not been taken. The division prepared for renewed assaults. Commanders counted men and weighted resources. Medics counted dressings and fought to keep their kits stocked. For Doss, disapproval had not vanished entirely. Institutional suspicion lingered. But the texture of his reputation was changing among the soldiers who had bled beside him. That shift in perception is one of the deeper ironies of wartime memory. Labels assigned in one season can be overturned in the next, not by propaganda, but by witness. Those who had shouted "coward" in a training yard found themselves later relaying stories of a man who would carry a stretcher on his shoulders while bullets cut the air around him. The complexities of bravery, moral courage that refuses to kill, physical courage that endures danger to save, began to complicate the simple judgments that had come before. As the 77th Division prepared for the next phase of operations on Okinawa, whispers of what had happened on the escarpment traveled down the line. Officers took stock of their medics. Soldiers checked their ammo and their consciences. Doss kept quietly preparing, sharpening bandage techniques, reinforcing rope knots, practicing carries on the scrubby training hills that looked nothing like the coral cliff they would soon face. He knew the danger. He had seen combat. He also believed that his place was among the wounded, not behind a weapon. And so the stage was set. A man sustained by conviction and faith, a unit worn by months of fighting, a ridge that loomed like a question. Orders would soon fall. Artillery would again soften the enemy lines. Men would again climb. The ridge would test tactics, tenacity, and human limits. For Desmond Doss, it would be a day that forced every element of his life, his childhood vow, his Adventist convictions, his training as a medic, to meet a single violent present. What followed on that ridge would be counted in official record as the saving of 75 lives. In memory, it would be written in the faces of men who had been lowered over the cliff and lived. For now, as the company tightened its belts and checked its ropes, there was only the thin electric hush before action and the long, cold knowledge that when the order came, some would rush forward with rifles, and one man, without a rifle, would go where the wounded lay. Orders fell like distant thunder. Men scrambled, voices cracked. The assault stalled. Company B pulled back. Smoke pooled in the hollows. Somewhere above the din, the ridge watched with a patient, hungry silence. In the chaos, wounded men lay where they had fallen. Some crawled and called with voices thin as thread. Others did not call at all. The official order to withdraw meant lives would be abandoned unless someone went back. The law of the line was simple. No man left behind, if it could be helped. The practice of war often made that a hope rather than a certainty. Desmond Doss did not interpret the order as a command to abandon the dying. He had been given permission to serve as a non-combatant medic. He had no rifle. He had only bandages, a little morphine, a stout pair of hands, and a faith that would not permit him to leave a man to die if there was a chance to save him. That conviction, more than any formal authority, guided what he did next. He began by searching the slope for stretchers. The rubble and heat had thinned their numbers. Some had been lost in the retreat, others were bent and broken. Doss found what he could. Where proper litters were scarce, he improvised. Canvas torn from packs, webbing tied in knots, a pair of hands placed under a man's shoulders and knees. These became the instruments of rescue. When the cliff face required lowering, he fashioned ropes into slings and secured them to whatever anchors he could find. A jagged coral outcrop, a large boulder, the boot of a soldier willing to tie himself to hope. Witnesses who stood on the ridge later described a methodical, almost mechanical cadence to his work. He would climb out to the edge, balance on a slope slick with mud and sweat, and peer down at a man unconscious or pleading. He would talk softly. He would pray softly. Then he would gather the wounded into his arms or onto a stretcher, attach the ropes, and send them down the face with a soldier or two controlling the descent. Each lowering was a negotiation with gravity and enemy aim. Each return was a decision: go back or stop. The first stretchers slid over the edge and found hands below to catch them. For some victims, the descent was the difference between life and oblivion. For others, the ride was brutal and slow, the rope scraping against coral and exposed flesh. Doss did not watch the litters drop and then wait in safety. He tied himself in and lowered, or he clambered down after them, sometimes carrying a man on his shoulders for 50 feet of cliff where ropes could not be relied upon. When the earth under his boots gave with a muted roar, when ledges crumbled like stale bread, he kept moving. Enemy fire pursued every motion. Bullets swept the slope in thin, lethal threads. Snipers, camouflaged in the scrub above the ridge, had clear fields of view. Mortar and machine gun fire flamed the air. Men later remembered seeing Doss within feet of enemy positions, seen and unseen, lowering soldiers who would otherwise have been left to bleed out on that coral edge. Some veterans used the language of providence to explain why so many lived. Others used the vocabulary of luck. A number of stories repeated one detail with particular astonishment. Several Japanese rifles reportedly jammed while pointing directly at rescuers. Those accounts circulated among the men and were recorded in oral histories. History can neither prove nor disprove every detail of those moments. It can only record the testimony and place it alongside the official tally. The tally, according to the Medal of Honor citation, credited Desmond Doss with saving 75 men on Meta Escarpment. That number became the official figure used in citations and military reports. Doss himself later estimated a lower number, around 50, an example of how memory and institutional accounting can diverge. Press reports in the immediate aftermath sometimes amplified totals even further. One contemporary article suggested a figure over 100, but that higher count is a product of wartime reporting and should be read with caution. The Medal of Honor citation remains the canonical record: 75 lives saved in the face of extreme danger. Hours stretched like a long, aching muscle. It was not a single sprint. It was continuous motion across a landscape that refused to give way. Doss worked for nearly 5 hours. He returned again and again. He could be seen tying knots with hands that trembled from exhaustion, whispering brief prayers between drags. According to some of those who were there, he would murmur, "Lord, help me get one more," then climbing back out over rocks slick with blood and rain and sweat. That line, often repeated in reminiscences, became a small refrain in the chorus of testimony: private, human, prayerful. Other medics and soldiers improvised alongside him. Some were too badly wounded to be moved. Others were hollered at by men who feared reconsolidation of enemy forces. The confusion made each decision to go back more dangerous. The ridge was littered with fragments of men and equipment that testified to failed assaults. At times, the enemy would press forward and force the rescuers to fall back together, only to surge forward again when artillery and reinforcements issued new orders. In that ebb and flow, Doss's resolve did not flicker. He focused on the tiny, immediate tasks in front of him. Stop the bleeding, place the dressing, build a litter that could survive a coral face, keep a man conscious. He worked under a command structure that did not always approve. Even after those hours on the ridge, Doss's relationship with some officers remained strained. Military institutions value conformity. They also value results. The sight of men living because of Doss's work began to shift how some leaders evaluated what a medic could contribute. Stories of his heroism filtered up the chain of command. A general, moved by his actions, would ultimately recommend him for the Medal of Honor. That recommendation would travel through channels, be examined, and be approved. For now, however, the ridge demanded only the immediate arithmetic of survival. The evacuation was complicated by simple human things: ropes frayed, hands blistered, litters slipping at inopportune moments. Once, a litter tied to an improvised harness swung into the open and left a man exposed to enemy fire until other hands could pull him back. On another occasion, a rescuer below the ridge was nearly crushed by a falling slab of coral. He survived, but the image stayed with those who saw it. The smell of cordage and coral and the metallic tang of blood mixed with the sour odor of overheated uniforms. Flies clustered on open wounds. The soundscape was a layered dissonance: artillery thuds, distant shouts, the continual hiss of automatic weapons. In the midst of it, there were quieter human scenes that veterans recalled with surprising tenderness. A medic who had been patched and lowered cried as his stretcher descended, not from pain, but from the relief of being pulled back into life. A young private, his face a map of shock, clasped Doss's hand and whispered thanks that he could hardly form into words. Another man, fearing that his time had passed, opened an eye and found a Bible pressed into his palm. Small acts, sharing a water canteen, holding a bandage in place while another man worked, became the texture of saving lives. When daylight broke toward the end of Doss's 5-hour push, the outlines of the ridge were scabbed with the marks of the battle. The company's survivors had been salvaged from pockets that would otherwise have remained graves. The immediate necessity had been met, but the cost and exhaustion were heavy. Men lay where they had collapsed. Doss, filthy and soaked in the evidence of the day, still refused to be carried away until the last man he could reach was on a litter and being lowered to safety. Word of what he had done spread down the line and beyond. Those who had once called him coward could not quite bring themselves to keep that verdict after watching him repeatedly risk his life to save theirs. Such reversals are small miracles of human judgment. A man is recast not by rules, but by witness. For those who had been pulled from the edge and lived, the label coward could not stand. The Ridge, that day, had written a new story in the private vocabularies of Company B. The practical aftermath brought its own paperwork and pain. Doss was not unscathed. He suffered wounds, shrapnel and blunt trauma, and like many who went through the Pacific campaigns, he would face long months of recovery. He endured surgeries and hospital stays. The body of a medic bears the scars of both giving and receiving care. Doss's later years would be marked by recurring health problems, including tuberculosis that necessitated the removal of a lung, and eventually, hearing loss significant enough to require a cochlear implant in later life. Yet even as his body paid a price, the story of his service pressed forward in public record. The Army recognized acts of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty, with its highest honors. The general who observed Doss's actions on the escarpment put forward a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. The award, when it arrived, did not erase the pain he had endured, or the tension he had faced within his unit. It did, however, place his name in the official catalog of recognized heroism. When President Harry S. Truman presented the medal, it was a moment that transformed a private conviction into a public emblem. That ceremony, simple and dignified, was an acknowledgement that bravery takes many forms, and that fidelity to conscience could coincide with the highest valor. After the war, life did not simply return to ease. Desmond Doss married Dorothy Shuta, whom he had met before the war. Their marriage endured the long shadow of his wounds and the quiet, complicated fame that came with being a decorated veteran. He worked in humble trades, painting and construction, and lived with the slow constraints of chronic illness. He refused to allow his identity to be pressed into the shape of celebrity. Still, people came to know his story. He became a living repository of a paradox, a man who, by refusing to kill, had saved lives on a scale nearly unmatched in his theater. Public recognition waxed and waned. For years, Doss was a figure known primarily in military circles, and among those who study war and conscience. In the early 21st century, his story reached a wider audience. Mel Gibson's film adaptation dramatized the events on Hacksaw Ridge for a large popular audience, with Andrew Garfield portraying Doss. The movie reinvigorated questions about courage and conscience, bringing the image of a weaponless medic lowering men over a cliff into living rooms and theaters around the world. The film did not invent Doss's actions, it amplified them, and with amplification came debates about representation, historical accuracy, and the tension between cinematic spectacle and the quiet realities of faith and moral conviction. Those conversations about how to tell a life, about how to honor nuance, are part of a larger cultural negotiation. Some commentators praised the film for rescuing a neglected story of moral courage. Others cautioned against turning a life into a spectacle. Veterans who had known Doss personally weighed in with their own memories, sometimes agreeing with the film's choices, sometimes criticizing its compressions. The tension was, in a way, fitting. Doss himself had lived at the intersection of spectacle and solitude, of public judgment and private conviction. Still, the essential facts remained. A young man from Lynchburg, shaped by a faith that shaped his conscience, had refused to bear arms and, in doing so, had saved 75 men on a brutal escarpment in Okinawa. The Medal of Honor inscribed that fact into the archive of official remembrance. The stories of men he rescued and the testimonies of fellow soldiers etched it into the living memory of those who had seen it. Over time, the public memory of Desmond Doss shifted from caricature to complexity. The word coward, once spat in training yards, became an artifact of a more ignorant season, one that could be corrected by witness. 80 years after those last battles, the question that rides the narrative is not merely historical accuracy. It is moral. Who gets to define courage? Is bravery a matter only of taking up arms and delivering fire? Or can it be rooted in the refusal to kill, combined with the willingness to risk one's life to save others? Doss's example complicates the categories that war often insists upon. He demonstrates that moral courage and physical courage are not opposites, but partners. A refusal to kill can coexist with the willingness to be killed to save others. There is also a lesson on institutional friction. Armies are, by necessity, organizations that prize obedience and conformity. They are not always comfortable with dissent of conscience, even when that conscience leads a man to extraordinary sacrifice. The fight Doss waged within military bureaucracy, facing hearings, taunts, and threats, reminds us that systems often require individuals to press their claims for ethical space. His insistence to serve with his unit, rather than sidestep danger, forced the institution to reckon with forms of service it did not initially understand. Memory itself is an active process. The way Doss is remembered tells us as much about the present as the past. In the decades after the war, as American culture has periodically re-examined the ethics of violence and the limits of patriotism, Doss's story has been a touchstone for debates about nonviolence, faith, and heroism. Some take his life as a clear vindication of pacifist principles. Others see it as a singular case of moral clarity in an otherwise ambiguous world. Both readings miss the nuance. Doss did not preach from a soapbox, nor did he seek to create a doctrine. He lived by a conviction that shaped choices in the smallest and largest moments. There are practical echoes, too. In military training and medical ethics programs, instructors point to his example when discussing non-combatant roles and the moral responsibilities of medics in war. For soldiers facing moral dilemmas today, his life offers a model of how conscience and duty can be negotiated under stress. For religious communities, Doss's story is a reminder that faith can lead to uncomfortable, costly commitments, that literal obedience to conscience can present both social friction and moral clarity. At home with Dorothy later in life, Doss carried the quiet gravity of a man whose actions had changed lives. He did not boast. He told stories in the matter-of-fact language of veterans who had seen what war did to men and then stepped back to live quietly. He died in 2006, surrounded by family. His funeral was attended by those who had served with him and by people who had learned his name through books and films. The country that had once called him coward had in many quarters come to call him hero. 80 years after 1945, his story still teaches. It asks us to consider the cost of conscience, the shape of courage, and the strange ways in which public reputation can be overturned by private witness. It invites us to hold discomfort, to know that a man can be both a nonconformist and a savior, that refusing to kill can be a form of the deepest courage. If one lesson stands clear after 8 decades, it is this. Bravery does not always look like violence. Sometimes bravery looks like a man tying a rope to a fragment of coral, lowering another human being into the arms of survival, and then going back for one more. It looks like a refusal that becomes action. It looks like faith translated into the practical labor of saving lives. Which part of Desmond Doss's story strikes you most? Was it the image of a man lowering the wounded over a cliff? The transformation from coward to Medal of Honor recipient? The way conscience forced an army to reckon with an alternative form of courage? Tell us in the comments which moment moved you. And if you want to explore deeper, check the description for sources and recommended reading and documentaries. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that courage wears many faces.